Every teacher knows the ritual. You load the bus, count the heads, count them again, and then you shout the number to the driver like a sacred oath. 22, 31, 16. And every child who stepped onto that bus in the morning is supposed to be the child who steps off it when you return. That's the contract. But what happens when the math breaks? When the head count you took at the museum exit gives you one more than the head count you took at the parking lot arrival end, no one can point to the stranger. Because the stranger looks exactly like it belongs. Tonight I'm telling you 3 stories from people who lived through that quiet, impossible betrayal of numbers. A teacher who returned from a colonial farmstead with 23 children, even though her roster listed 22. And the extra boy had a smile that made her forget to ask his name. A student on a cave tour whose group photo revealed a grinning face wedged between classmates, a face no one saw in the dark. And a museum guide who watched a figure from a diorama climb onto a school bus and start mimicking the living, one seat at a time. These are not ghost stories in the traditional sense. These are accounts of intrusion, of entities that wear a child's shape and slip through the crack in your attention. And by the time you realize the count is off, they've already followed you home. Turn down the lights, double-check your memory of every field trip you ever took, and settle in. This is the compilation you asked for. I have taught school for 31 years, and I have never once miscounted a child, except that day at Greystone Colonial Farm. It was a crisp October morning in 2004, and I had 22 fourth graders on the bus. A number I knew by heart because we'd done a buddy check at the school gate. Greystone was a living history site with a red barn, a blacksmith shop, and a one-room schoolhouse reenactment. And the children were buzzing with the kind of excitement that makes chaperones rub their temples. After the butter churning demonstration, I lined everyone up for lunch headcount on the lawn, and I counted 23. I remember frowning at my clipboard, running my finger down the list, and thinking I must have miscounted that morning. 23 faces looked up at me. All familiar Tommy with his red cap, Sarah with her braids, a quiet boy in a homespun costume that the farm staff must have loaned him, pale and dark-eyed, standing at the end of the line with a small, patient smile. I didn't recall a costume loan, but the boy looked at home in it, and he was so still and unobtrusive that I marked him down in my head as part of the group and moved on. The rest of the trip went smoothly. Though I had a nagging sense that something was off, the children seemed slightly subdued. The pale boy never spoke, never ate a bite of his lunch, just watched me with that gentle, fond expression that made me think of a grandchild. When we loaded the bus to go home, I counted heads at the door, 23. I counted them again in their seats, 23. I called roll from my list of 22 names. And every name was answered, and when I looked back toward the rear seat where the pale boy had settled, he lifted a slender hand and gave a small wave. And I thought, of course, he's always been here. We arrived back at the school, and I ushered the children into the gym for pickup. My principal, Mr. Delaney, stood at the door with a concerned expression and asked why one of my students was in colonial costume. I turned to point out the boy, but the costume was gone. The pale boy was gone. I couldn't find him anywhere in the gym or in the bus or on the playground. I started to panic, and I demanded a parent pickup list check-in. That's when my mind broke a little. 22 children were picked up by their parents. 22 children matched 22 names on my roster. There was no 23rd child. But when I described the pale, dark-eyed boy to my students the next day, 5 of them said they remembered him too. He had sat next to Molly at lunch. He had held the door for James at the schoolhouse. He had hummed a tune that sounded like a nursery rhyme none of them knew. One child, a quiet boy named Caleb, burst into tears and said the pale boy had whispered something in his ear during the hayride. "You can stay here, and I'll go home instead. No one will notice." Caleb said he'd felt a tugging, like something trying to pull him out of his own skin, and he'd nearly said yes. That weekend, I drove back to Greystone Farm on my own, and I asked the curator if any child had ever gone missing there. She went pale and led me to a small cemetery plot on the edge of the property, where a headstone read, Elias Wren B., 1794 D, 1804, beloved son, lost in the Great Barn Fire. The dates meant the boy would have been 10 years old when he died, the same age as my students. And the stone had a small, weathered etching of a child's face that matched the smile I'd seen on the bus. I understood then that Elias had been riding along on field trips for maybe 200 years. Looking for a child who would trade places, a child who wouldn't be missed. I had loaded 22, and I had returned with 22, but for one long afternoon, I had stood guardian over 23, and the extra one had almost succeeded. I still teach, but every field trip I take, I count the heads obsessively. I stare into every face until I'm certain the eyes that look back are fully, safely human. Our 7th grade field trip to the cavern of the Sleeping River was supposed to be the highlight of Earth science. And for the first 2 hours, it was just that sticky limestone handrails. Guide issued heart-its and a lot of echoing jokes about bats. The deep cave section was a narrow, winding passage that ended in a giant chamber called the Cathedral Room. Where the guide gathered us for a group photo, we all squished together on the wet stone, grinning under the dim amber lights, and the flash went off twice. I remember thinking that the cavern suddenly felt colder, as if something had exhaled against the back of my neck. But I shrugged it off and climbed back up the metal stairs with the others. We loaded the bus. The guide counted heads 31, the same number we'd started with, and we drove home. A week later, the guide sent our teacher a digital copy of the group photo to share with parents. And when it popped up on the projector in class, a ripple of unease passed through the room. There, in the back row, wedged between Sarah Kim and me, was an extra face. It wasn't a trick of shadow. It was a distinct pale face with dark hollows for eyes and a stretched, lipless grin that exposed to many teeth, the features blurred as if the person had been vibrating slightly when the flash fired. Nobody remembered anyone standing there. Sarah Kim turned to me with wide eyes and whispered that during the photo, she'd felt something cold and damp pressing against her shoulder, but she'd assumed it was my jacket. It wasn't. The teacher recounted the heads in the photo. There were 32 figures. We had been 31 on the trip. I asked for a copy of the image, and that night I studied it pixel by pixel. My skin crawling as I realized that the grinning face wasn't just a photo of Bamit's hands, long and white with too many joints, were resting on my shoulder and Sarah's shoulder with a possessive curl. Over the next few weeks, the photo became an obsession. I would glance at it on my phone before bed, and I started to notice something. The extra face was moving, not between versions of the file. The same file, every time I opened it, the grin was a fraction wider, the head tilted a little closer to mine. Then, one Monday, I opened the photo, and the extra face was gone. I felt a flood of relief that lasted exactly 3 seconds. Because I glanced up at my bedroom window, and in the reflection, I saw a pale, lipless grin hovering just behind my left shoulder. I spun around, nothing there. But the reflection didn't lie. It was still smiling, and I could feel a cold, damp pressure on my shoulder, exactly where the hand had been. I didn't sleep in that room for a month. I started seeing the face and other reflections. The microwave door, a puddle on the sidewalk, the dark screen of a turned-off TV. It never did anything threatening. It just watched, grinning, patient, its hand always resting on me. I told my parents, who sent me to a therapist, and the therapist told me about pareidolia and stress. But I know what I saw, and I know what I still see. A few months ago, I contacted Sarah Kim, who had moved to a different state. She wouldn't talk about the cave trip at first, but eventually she admitted that she still felt cold pressure on her shoulder every night, and sometimes she woke up with a bruise in the shape of long fingers. The cave gave us an extra passenger, and I don't think it ever left. The Hartfield Museum of Natural History had a tired diorama hall that nobody visited. Any more dusty glass cases showing pioneer families, woolly mammoths, and a little prairie schoolhouse scene with child-sized mannequins wearing bonnets. I gave the field trip tours twice a week. And I always hurried groups past that hall because the mannequins unsettled me, especially the one in the corner. A thin boy in a patched coat, his painted eyes too bright, his mouth set in a faint, knowing smirk. One Tuesday in March, a busload of second graders arrived for their rock and fossil unit, 34 of them, all name-tagged and wiggling. I led them through the exhibits, and when we passed the diorama hall, I noticed something wrong immediately. The corner mannequin was gone. I felt a cold stone settle in my stomach, but I told myself maintenance had removed it for cleaning, and I rushed the children toward the cafeteria. Lunch passed without incident, and afterward I walked the group to the parking lot to board the bus. The teacher, Mr. Albright, counted heads as the children climbed aboard 34, and then he paused, forehead creasing, and counted again. 35. Counted a third time, allowed his finger moving over the bus seats. And I saw his face lose color. I climbed in behind him and scanned the rows, and there, sitting placidly in the very back seat, was a small figure in a patched coat, with bright painted eyes and a knowing smirk. The mannequin. It was no longer made of wax and cloth. It moved. Its chest rose and fell, its fingers flexible now. Reel were folded in its lap, and its head slowly swiveled toward us as if it had been waiting to be noticed. The children around it didn't seem afraid. They chattered obliviously, as if they couldn't see the thing in their midst, or as if their minds had been smoothed over into acceptance. Mr. Albright started to say something, but his voice died, and I saw him counting on his fingers with a dazed expression, the number slipping out of his head every time he looked at the mannequin. I grabbed his arm and pointed, but when he looked, his gaze slid off the back seat like water off oil. "There's no one there, Mira," he said, his voice distant. "We have 34. It's fine." I realized with a jolt of pure terror that the entity could cloud perception, make itself invisible to belief unless you fought hard enough to see it. I forced my eyes to lock onto its face, and the mannequin smiled wider, its jaw unhinging a fraction too far. And it lifted one hand and waved at me a slow, mocking flutter of fingers. Then it turned its head toward the little boy next to it, a red-haired child named Oliver, whose name tag I remembered, and I watched the mannequin's features shift. The patched coat dissolved into Oliver's blue hoodie. The painted eyes softened into Oliver's brown ones. The smirk resculpted into Oliver's exact resting expression. In the space of a breath, the mannequin was gone, and there were two Olivers on the back seat, identical, sitting side by side. One of them looked at me with silent desperation, tears starting in his eyes. The other looked at me with the mannequin's knowing smirk, wearing Oliver's face like a borrowed coat. My throat closed. I wanted to scream, to pull the real Oliver off the bus. But I couldn't tell which was which, and Mr. Albright was already telling the driver to close the doors. I stumbled off the bus and through the window. I saw the two Olivers. The crying one slowly stopped crying as the smiling one placed a hand on his shoulder. And then they both turned to face forward, expressions perfectly neutral. The bus drove away. I reported everything to my director, who nodded sympathetically and later eliminated my position. Citing budget cuts. I contacted Oliver's parents anonymously, and all they would say was that their son had been a little off since the field trip, quieter, more obedient, sometimes standing in his room at night staring at the wall with a smile they didn't recognize. I still go to the Hartfield Museum sometimes, though it's closed now. The diorama hall is dark, and the mannequin's corner is empty, but I know it isn't gone. It's out there in the world, wearing someone's child, riding school buses. Joining headcounts, finding new groups to infiltrate. And every time I see a school bus on the road, I count the faces in the window, holding my breath, dreading the moment I count one too many and see that smirk reflected in the glass. 3 accounts, all different, all pointing to the same quiet horror, that the world is full of gaps where things slip through, and a field trip is the perfect camouflage. A headcount is just a number until the number lies, and then it's a door left ajar. If these stories unsettled you, if they made you want to dig out your old class photos and count the faces one more time, please hit that like button and subscribe for more true horror that crawls under your skin and stays there. I read every comment, so leave your own field trip nightmares down below, and if you've ever felt like your bus came back with someone extra, I want to hear it. Until next time, count carefully, watch the quiet ones, and never ever assume that what climbed on board with you is what will climb off.